Rufus landed hard on the dirt floor. Rose's kick had caught him off guard when she fought him. He had wanted to lie down. He was exhausted. The Texas sun had drained his energies. He then knew that Rose and he wouldn't sleep together that night, but he knew they would eventually have to. It was how things worked under slavery. Some called him a bully, but he knew who held the real power. Some days before, Rufus's master had told him that it was time for him to make babies. The master told him to pair up with Rose, another slave like himself. Rufus didn't know her well, but had seen her around, working, not who he would have picked. He liked another young woman, but in this life you did as you were told, or you paid the consequences. Rufus was no stranger to being told what to do with his body. Lift this, carry that, sleep here, move now, sleep with her and make babies. He hated his master for telling him whom to have sex with, but he knew he had no choice. He'd been poked, prodded, stripped, whipped, leered at, and now mated. At times he wondered if they even knew he was a man. Life with Rose would work out. It was better than getting lashed for resisting. And he had wanted to have children someday and head a household. But for now, he found himself on a dirt floor, tasting blood and faced with a woman wielding a fireplace poker. Tonight, he would sleep outside. And, as the saying goes, Rufus was caught between a rock and a hard place. Male slave owners used sexual assault to dominate, dehumanize, and emasculate male slaves in American antebellum South. The oppression and violence that characterized the institution of chattel slavery are easily accessible, as well as the sexual assault often inflicted on female slaves. Although many slave narratives and journals address female rape and other forms of sexual assault, the abuse endured by male slaves has been grossly overlooked. The intention of this video is not to discredit the suffering of female slaves, but the research suggested that the same use of sexual assault as a form of discipline and control was applied to male slaves, and even worse. There is a general consensus that only women were subjected to the violently lustful assaults of slave owners. A closer analysis of the narratives of Olaudah Equiano, Harriet Jacobs, and Frederick Douglass revealed the underlying issue that male slaves were going through similar situations. All of this was an attempt to increase American wealth through the forced labor of an entire race. In this video, we are taking you on a brief journey that would by all means humble you with reflection when you start to have a clue on what it feels like to be a black male slave. Before we go forward, support our work by kindly hitting the thumb button, share with friends and families to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative, and subscribe to stay with us for more interesting and revealing videos while you keep the channel growing. Now let us get back in. When many people hear of someone being abused, the first thing that comes to their mind is rape. So you may be wondering, can a man be raped? Do men get raped? The truth is, the historical abuses of especially black male slaves, by even white women elites, would forever be shocking. You don't want to go there. Tales of it are indeed so horrible, so nerve-wracking, that the most frightening horror movies would appear more like comedies in comparison. But in the almighty USA, male rape was not seen as an issue until recently, in the year 2012, when FBI's Uniform Crime Report redefined rape as the penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. The prior definition had not changed since 1927 and gained the attention of sexual assault awareness groups because it had alienated the victims who did not fit the definition, the carnal knowledge of a female, forcibly and against her will, with sole emphasis on female and vagina. While it is yet to be legislated in many top world countries, even in the United Kingdom previously, English law did not include rape of males as a criminal offense, and it was recorded as non-consensual buggery. A convicted rapist of a female could be imprisoned for life, stated Henry Leake, the chairman of Survivors Organization, while buggery, that is the rape of a male, only carried 10 years maximum as a sentence. Until 2003 with the Sexual Offenses Act, and in 2005 a further distinction between mouth, anus, or vagina when sentencing. Scotland and Northern Ireland Acts were, in 2009 and 2008, respectively recognized that men can be both perpetrators and victims. However, in all parts of the United Kingdom, a female cannot be legally charged with rape. She must be instead charged with other offenses, such as sexual assault, assault by penetration, or causing sexual activity without consent. of which the latter two carry the same maximum sentence. Following the trend, other countries like Nigeria has just amended her abuse and rape laws to include males this year, 2024. You would be surprised at the staggering statistics of male rape. As of 1998, 2.78 million men in the U.S. had been victims of attempted or completed rape. About 3% of American men, or 1 in 33, have experienced an attempted or completed rape in their lifetime. 1 out of every 10 rape victims are male. Despite this, historically, rape was thought to be and defined as a crime committed solely against females. This belief is still held in some parts of the world, but rape of males is now commonly criminalized and has been subject to more discussion than in the past. Males are far less likely to report sexual abuse than females. Rape of males is still taboo and has a negative connotation among heterosexual and homosexual men. Community and service providers often react differently to male victims based on their sexual orientation and the gender of their perpetrators. It may be difficult for male victims to report a sexual assault they experienced, especially in a society with a strong masculine custom. They might be afraid that people will doubt their sexual orientation and label them homosexual, especially if raped by a male, or that they may be seen as unmasculine because they were a victim, and therefore many statistics underestimate how many males are raped due to their unwillingness to report sexual assault and rape. Most of the time, male victims try to hide and deny their victimization, similar to female victims, unless they have serious physical injuries. Eventually, the male victims may be very vague in explaining their injuries when they are seeking medical or mental health services, and we are talking of the 21st century. How much more of the slavery eras of 18th and 19th centuries? However, an abuse is beyond sexual assault or rape. We may have to do a deep dive into classifications of abuse later in the video. Meanwhile, let's run with this understanding. Now back to Rufus's experience. Many people may not be surprised at such abuse and mistreatment coming from a male slaver. But to think or imagine that the same and worse than that were done by white women, as slavers or such, would and should be unexpected. Sadly, there are records of many of these inhumane treatments on male slaves by white women. Many narratives regarding slavery tend to focus on the physical abuse of slaves, such as whippings, but do not focus on the sexual abuse that both female and male slaves suffered from. The sexual abuse that enslaved males and females faced was used as a weapon to control slaves physically and psychologically. Not discussing the sexual violence that whites perpetrated against enslaved peoples erases the horrific acts that were committed to them. The legacy of this often unspoken part of slavery has led to African American men and women to become hypersexualized in the United States. Black men are perceived as being sexual predators because they cannot control their sexual urges, and black women are portrayed as being sexually promiscuous and therefore constantly looking for sexual partners. These racial and sexist stereotypes have not been recently constructed. There is a history behind them. When describing the physical attributes and the lives of Africans and blacks, whites often compared them to animals, such as orangutans. By comparing Africans and blacks to orangutans and claiming that they had sexual relations with them, white men believed that they did not need consent when engaging in sexual acts with their slaves. Since animals did not give consent to one another when breeding, African slaves and their descendants were to be treated in the same manner since they were considered to be animals themselves. Due to the animalistic comparisons between Africans and apes, black women were considered to be sexually promiscuous, and therefore they could not be raped because it would be interpreted in court as them actively looking to have sexual relations with a man. Black men were also considered to be sexually promiscuous, which led to whites defining sexual assault as a violent incident if the perpetrator was black. In contrast, sexual assault that was committed by a white person was deemed as a sexual act. With this assumption, white women slave owners tend to maximize their gains from their cartel slaves, especially male, and these white women slavers were in numbers. It's estimated that 40% of slave owners may have been white women. White women were active and violent participants in the slave market. They bought, sold, managed, and sought the return of enslaved people in whom they had a vested economic interest. Owning a large number of enslaved people made a woman a better marriage prospect. Once married, white women fought in courts to preserve their legal ownership over enslaved people, as opposed to their husband's ownership, and often won.
For them, slavery was their freedom.
Jones Rogers observes in her book, Jones-Rogers argues that white women were actually trained to participate from a very young age.
Their exposure to the slave market is not something that begins in adulthood. It begins in their homes when they are little girls, sometimes infants, when they're given enslaved people as gifts.
She says. Jones-Rogers shows that part of white children's training in plantation management involved beating enslaved people. And this was not without the least cruelty.
It didn't matter whether the child was large or small. They always beat you till the blood ran down.
One woman told the Works Progress Administration, WPA. One of such white women, Martha Gibbs, one of the richest women in Virginia, as that when she married George Washington in 1759, owned 84 enslaved people, while the husband, George, may have owned around 18 people by then. Martha was reported to have even taken enslaved people to Texas and forced them to work for her at gunpoint until 1866, a year after slavery's formal abolition. From accounts from one of Gibbs's former slaves, Lit Young, interviewed as part of the Federal Writers Project, FWP, of the Works Progress Administration, WPA, established by the Roosevelt administration in 1935.
Gibbs was a big, rich Irish woman who weren't scared of no man. She owned and operated a large steam sawmill on the Warner Bayou in Vicksburg, where it emptied into the Mississippi River.
Gibbs owned a significant number of slaves, so many, in fact, that she had to build 2 sets of whitewashed quarters with glass windows to house them all. She also built a nice church with glass windows and a brass cupalo for their worship. She fed them well, but she worked them hard too. In step with other slave owners throughout the South, Gibbs employed an overseer to make sure that the people she kept enslaved performed the tasks delegated to them. But she also oversaw her overseer. Almost every morning, she buckled on 2 guns and would come out to the place to personally ensure that things were running smoothly, and she outcussed a man when things didn't go right. Twice married and once widowed, Gibbs would not permit either of her husbands to interfere with her financial affairs, including the management of her slaves. Even though her second husband was a reputable physician in Vicksburg, he had little influence over her or the slave-related activities on their plantation. Lit Young remembered Gibbs's husband addressing her after witnessing the brutal whippings her overseer inflicted upon her slaves. He softly interjected,
"Darling, you ought not to whip them poor black folks so hard. They's going to be free just like us sometimes."
Shut up. Sometime I believe you as a Yankee anyway.
One day, when her husband had gone to buy corn for his livestock, she gathered up some of her slaves, 10 6-mule wagons, and 1 ox cook wagon, and set off with them. They walked about 215 miles from Vicksburg, Mississippi, to about 3 miles from Marshall, Texas. She hired Irishman guards with rifles to make sure that none of her freed slaves ran away during the journey, and when they stopped to rest, the guards tied the men to trees. Then on June 19, 1866, 1 year after these legally free but still enslaved people made her first crop in Texas, Martha Gibbs finally let them go. Another one of the white women slavers, and arguably the most notorious for her cruelty to black slaves, especially male, was Madame Blanc, or, after her third marriage, Madame Laori, born Marie Delphine McCarty on March 19, 1787 in New Orleans, Spanish Louisiana, was a New Orleans socialite and later would-be serial killer who was believed to have tortured and murdered a great number of enslaved people in her household mansion. Of the many investigations and cases of her cruelty, she most likely earned her notorious reputation for the incident reported in the New Orleans Bee of April 11, 1834. Bystanders responding to the fire attempted to enter the quarters of those enslaved to ensure that everyone had been evacuated. Upon being refused the keys by the Laoris, the bystanders broke down the doors to the quarters and found 7 people, more or less horribly mutilated, suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other, who claimed to have been imprisoned there for some months. One of those who entered the premises was Judge Jean-Francois J.F. Canonge, who said that, when he questioned Laurie's husband about those enslaved on the property, he was told in an insolent manner that some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle with other people's business. A version of this story, circulating in 1836 and recounted by the historian Martineau, added that the enslaved people were emaciated, showed signs of being flayed with a whip, were bound in restrictive postures, and wore spiked iron collars which kept their heads in static positions. When the discovery of the abused and enslaved people became widely known, a mob of local citizens attacked the Royal Street mansion of Madame Laori and demolished and destroyed everything upon which they could lay their hands. A sheriff and his officers were called to disperse the crowd, but by the time the mob left, the property had sustained major damage, with scarcely anything remaining but the walls. The vindicators were taken to a local jail, where they were available for public viewing. The Bee reported that by April 12th, up to 4,000 people had attended to view the slaves to convince themselves of their sufferings. The Pittsfield Sun, citing the New Orleans Advertiser, and writing several weeks after the evacuation of Laurie's quarters of her victims, claimed that 2 of the enslaved people found in the mansion had died following their rescue. It added,
"We understand that in digging the yard, bodies have been disinterred, and the condemned well in the grounds of the mansion, having been uncovered, others, particularly that of a child, were found."
Madame Laori fled New Orleans during the mob violence that followed the fire to evade justice, taking a coach to the waterfront and traveling by schooner to Mobile, Alabama, and then to Paris. She reportedly died in France under unclear circumstances. In 1888, George Washington Cable recounted a popular but unsubstantiated story that Laori had died in France in a boar hunting accident. However, in the late 1930s, Eugene Bax, who served as sexton to St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 until 1924, discovered an old cracked copper plate in Alley 4 of the cemetery. The inscription on the plate read, "Madame Laori, née Marie Delphine McCarthy, décédée à Paris le 7 décembre 1842, à l'âge de 6. The English translation of the inscription reads, "Madame Laori, born Marie Delphine McCarthy, died in Paris December 7, 1842, at the age of 6, meaning 60-something years." But according to the French archives of Paris, Laori died on December 7, 1849, at the age of 62. After 1945, accounts of those enslaved by the Lauries became more explicit. John de Levine, writing in Ghost Stories of Old New Orleans, 1946, alleged that Laori had a sadistic appetite that seemed never appeased until she had inflicted on one or more of her black servitors some hideous form of torture, and claimed that those who responded to the 1834 fire had found male slaves, stark naked, chained to the wall, their eyes gouged out, their fingernails pulled off by the roots. Others had their joints skinned and festering, great holes in their buttocks where the flesh had been sliced away, their ears hanging by shreds, their lips sewn together. Intestines were pulled out and knotted around naked waists. There were holes in the skulls, where a rough stick had been inserted to stir the brains. This is just crazy, and nothing short of the work of the mind of a twisted monster with neither humane upbringing nor indoctrination. However, has the act of slavery ever been civilized? Where's the so-called high-born in such barbarism? Nonetheless, to round up this section of the video, the height of abuse affected on black male slaves by white women was believed to have happened more than reported due to the peculiarities of the time. One of the few available public records of such occurrences was by the former slave Charles Ball in his 1837 autobiography, where he described meeting the daughter of a wealthy planter in one of the lower counties of Georgia, who had given birth to a mixed-race son. The family considered sending her out of state until the birth, but instead, the girl was kept in her father's house until the birth of her child, which she was not permitted to nurse, it being taken from her. She was degraded from her rank in society, and her child was sold into slavery. Sexual contact between white women and black men did occur in slaveholding societies, more often than perhaps many are aware. Here are some of the factors that did or may have contributed to the incidence of such relations. First, even though the sexuality of Southern white women was heavily regulated, women were not as entirely sexually repressed as one might assume. According to historian Elizabeth Fox Genovese, 1998, slaveholding culture emphasized control of female sexuality. It did not deny its existence. She says that white women had a striking lack of neurotic inhibition. Like their husbands, Southern women had pre- and extramarital sex, though not as often. The dangers of having sexual relations with a black man rather than a white man were enormous in terms of the possibility of producing a mixed-race child. Although birth control and abortion methods in the 19th century were not as widely used, safe, or accessible as they are today, they, however, existed. Condoms made out of animal skin, membrane, oiled silk, and rubber were used along with other contraceptive techniques to prevent pregnancy. For much of the 19th century, abortion was largely unregulated, and it was not limited to poor, immigrant, or black women. Upper and middle-class white women too had abortions. This would have allowed white women to have affairs with black men with some level of confidence that they would not be caught. There is also a possibility that affairs between white women and slaves were simply not noticed or recorded as often as they occurred. While it may have been expected to a certain extent that white men would transgress morally, for example by having sexual relations with slaves, a white woman choosing to have sex with a black man might not have been considered a likely occurrence. Additionally, an upper-class woman under suspicion of an affair with a slave could readily invoke images of chastity in order to allay trouble for herself, or in other words, accuse the slave of rape. Because black men, like black women, were seen as inherently lustful and prone to sexual vice, for an elite woman to have illicit sex with a black rather than a white man might have been a slightly safer bet. It was easier to blame a black man of rape than a white man. Why these women chose to sexually abuse slaves probably varied by situation. Perhaps some of them were simply bored or sexually frustrated, since many of their men were having their fill. It is possible the sexual exploitation of slaves by women who had little power in relation to white men was a source of enjoyment that created a feeling of power. White women whose affairs with slaves were made known faced varying degrees of public humiliation. When a planter's daughter or wife was discovered to be pregnant by a slave, great pains were taken to cover up the pregnancy. The resulting child might have been sold into slavery, but infanticide was not an uncommon means of avoiding scandal. Of course, scandal was not always avoided, as was in the case described by Charles Ball in his autobiography mentioned above. According to one historian, few scholars will have viewed the relationships of enslaved men and free white women through the lens of sexual abuse, in part because of gendered assumptions about sexual power. This is in keeping with both the standard feminist conceptualization of rape as a tool of patriarchal oppression, as well as the traditional, unfeminist notion of women as too weak, emotionally and physically, to commit serious crimes, let alone sexual abuse, and the idea that men cannot be raped. However, it is becoming increasingly clear that women too are capable of committing sexual offenses and using sex as a means of domination and control. Indeed, there is considerable documentation of white women forcing black men into having sexual relations. According to Captain Richard J. Hinton, an abolitionist commander in the Civil War,
I have never found a bright-looking colored man, whose confidences I have won, who has not told me of instances where he has been compelled, either by his mistress or by white women of the same class, to have connection with them.
One former slave told Hinton that his mistress ordered him to sleep with her after her husband died. These are just two examples of the many stories abolitionists like Hinton told to prove the immorality of slaveholding. In Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Jacobs mentions how planters' daughters would take advantage of male slaves.
They know that the women slaves are subject to their father's authority in all things, and in some cases they exercise the same authority over the men slaves. I have myself seen the master of such a household whose head was bowed down in shame, for it was known in the neighborhood that his daughter had selected one of the meanest slaves on his plantation to be the father of his first grandchild. She did not make her advances to her equals, meaning white men of high social class, nor even to her father's more intelligent servants. She selected the most brutalized, over whom her authority could be exercised with less fear of exposure.
Even if the young white woman in this story did not consider herself a sexual assaulter, which she probably did not, this is clearly sexually predatory behavior. The kind of relationship described here, which Jacobs suggests was not uncommon, cannot be classified as consensual in any meaningful sense of the word, and in fact constitutes a form of sexual abuse, if not rape. We thus see that plantation mistresses and elite women, like their male counterparts, were able to sexually control and abuse their slaves. Another way in which white women were able to exercise sexual control over slaves was by threatening to accuse them of rape or attempted rape if they did not agree to sex. In doing this, elite white women used one of the primary instruments of patriarchal repression, the idea that they were weak and in need of white male protection, and by extension, in need of control and domination by white men, to exercise racial control over slaves. Instead of attempting to dismantle the white patriarchal hegemony that oppressed both slaves and, to a lesser extent, white women, predatory white women who coerced slaves into sex through threat of rape opted to perpetuate both white supremacy and patriarchy by reinforcing paternalistic notions of female sexuality. Why these women chose to sexually abuse slaves probably varied by situation. Perhaps some of them were simply bored or sexually frustrated, but perhaps, at least on a subconscious level, sexually exploiting slaves was a means of compensating for their lack of power in other aspects of their lives. Again, planter-class women were considered the property of their husbands and lacked considerable sexual agency relative to men. It is possible the sexual exploitation of slaves by women who had little power in relation to white men was a source of enjoyment that created a feeling of power. This is not to excuse the actions of these sexually abusive white women, nor is it to suggest that female sexual abuse of slave men would not have occurred had women enjoyed a higher status in society. However, just as slave-owning white women often took out their frustrations on slaves through excessive cruelty and violence, they probably also used sex as a means of domination and control in a society in which they were relatively powerless. In closing, the issue of upper-class white female sex with and sexual abuse of male slaves has not received the scholarly attention it deserves. Hodes White Women, Black Men is the only book on the subject. Most other works on antebellum slaveholding society either mention it in passing or, like Clinton's The Plantation Mistress, dismiss the possibility of upper-class women having sex with slaves. Although such relations were rarer than sex between male masters and slave women, they were no less complicated, problematic, and potentially exploitative, and no less worthy of scholarly analysis. That brings us to the end of yet another eye-opening video. Thank you for watching.